Okay, so people will probably still drift in over the next few minutes, but I just want to give a bit of a background into how this workshop came about and why, and to also talk about who's been involved in putting it together, our sources of funding. It's been in the planning phase for over a year. It came out of an article I saw about the fish maw trade in Papua New Guinea and the take of large barramundi and the disposal of carcasses, the interactions with some of the iconic threatened species like sawfish. And I started to dig around a little bit more about the trade because I knew almost nothing about it. And I came across a paper by Yvonne Sadovi, and Yvonne and I have been doing some work on and off. We're doing some work at the moment for IUCN, and put together this idea of a workshop. And we then found a couple of fellow travellers and found and formed a steering committee. So the steering committee is Yvonne, who's a professor from Hong Kong University, but now based in the United Kingdom. And we also have Simone Louw from Traffic, based in South Africa. Simone's been working on fish maw in Africa for some time. And then there was also Jeff Kinch, who at the time was at the National Fisheries College based in Papua New Guinea, and recently started to work with the FAO based in the Solomons. And so we looked at what were the options for funding, and we also started to map out what the issues were, and realised from our discussions it was quite large and global in scope. We put forward some funding ideas to two foundations. One of them is the ADM Capital Foundation based out of Hong Kong. I've known ADM for well over 10 years, and we've done bits and pieces together over that time. ADM has a long history of being involved in fisheries issues and a variety of other issues in East Asia. And we did some work together on some strategic planning and work on trawl. That they've also been funding some big picture projects, such as modelling the effects of climate change on the South China Sea. The second funder is the Sustainable Fisheries and Communities Trust, which is a small and new foundation based in the United Kingdom. It has a particular interest in small scale and community fisheries. At the moment, they're funding the development of a small scale fisheries certification program called Community Catch, which is global in scope. It's not just restricted to developing countries. So both of those funders kindly allocated some funds to enable us to get this webinar going. And just as a bit of background as to me, I'm a fisheries consultant based in Australia. I'm interested in fisheries management. At the moment, I'm doing some work with the FAO in Cambodia, writing a management plan. I've been involved in working with businesses in Asia and other countries on sustainability and getting people aligned in the right direction in terms of sustainable use. I'm also a visiting fellow at the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security down at the University of Wollongong, and ANCORS is a fisheries management and policy school with quite wide connections globally, and we do a lot of training work with people around the world. I mentioned earlier that we are running this session over three days or 3 evenings from my perspective. We had a discussion about what's the best format for webinars and workshops. Spending long days doesn't work for people, so we split it into 3. Each session will be 3 hours. and it will be that at the beginning of each day, there'll be a short introduction, and then either 2 or 3 presentations of about 20 minutes, followed by 5 minutes for clarifications. There's a couple of pre-records. So today we have one, and then on Thursday we have another one, just because of time zone issues. At the end of those 2 sessions, there'll be a short tea or comfort break, depending upon where you are, and then 2 or more presentations after that. And again, the same format, 20 minutes followed by 5 minutes for discussion. At the end of the day, there'll be a longer time for discussions. So the discussions will be via the chat area, and I'll be handing over to Nadia in a minute to give you a bit more detail on how the chat option works through Zoom. I also want to thank our 2 IT folks, Liberty and Nadia. Without them, I would have been extremely, well, basically out of my depth in trying to organise something like this. And so really grateful to have their assistance. And so Nadia, can I hand over to you, and can you just sort of run through how the chat area works and how we're going to manage the conversations? And I see quite a lot of people logging in through the chat area, which is great.
Sorry, I'll just take over instead of Nadia. She might be having technical difficulties. So yeah, everyone joining the call, thank you very much for joining. Just to just give you a quick overview with how to answer questions and ask questions in our webinar. So basically there's a Q&A box which should be on the bottom of your screen. If you click that, it gives you the option to answer and ask questions. So if you ask questions in there, those will be viewable by everyone on the presentation, and all the panelists, and our panelists can answer as we go. There's also the opportunity to like and upvote questions. So please, we welcome you to do that too. And also we encourage you to use the chat box feature to introduce where you're joining from, and if you have any further questions for our speakers. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Liberty. So in looking at what are the aims of the session, as I said earlier, we had a lot of discussions about the scope of the fish maw trade, and it became very apparent that it's not only complicated and global, but that fish maws are used for quite a variety of products, and they come from a variety of fisheries and also many different types of species. And so trying to get a feel for what the current state of knowledge is about this particular trade. As I mentioned earlier, there's been a number of papers published on this, and people have tried to map out what was known at the time. So we're using this opportunity to update where we can. We're also starting to look on day 3 at the management of fisheries, whether it's specifically for species taken for the fish maw trade or more broadly, because what we know so far is that some species are taken specifically for their fish maw, others it's an incidental byproduct of being taken for other purposes. And so over the next couple of days, we'll be gradually working into a discussion on Thursday about some of the challenges of working with what are at times very complex fisheries situations involving highly diverse groups of species, often in countries where fisheries management is not well developed, and then also dealing with a trade which, even if it's into Europe, can at times lack transparency about what's actually being used and from where it's being sourced from. So we're hoping that we encourage a lot of dialogue between people. I've already been able to learn some things just from some of the email interactions that we've been having. so far as we've been preparing for this for this webinar. And I also know that there's a lot of existing relationships out there. I know we started out thinking that we may get about 30 people involved, but there's been such a huge amount of interest. We've got people, I think, from about 20 countries spread across the world. We have people from science, from government, from NGOs, people who are working in developing countries, people who are working on fisheries or marine conservation issues, and those involved in markets and the trade as well. So it's a really diverse group of people, and I'd encourage you to to connect up as much as possible, either during the workshop or afterwards. We were originally thinking about having a group photograph, but that was when we had about thinking we might have about 30 participants. So we're going to skip that if that's okay, but we will be sharing details with people's permission about contacts so that you can follow up at some stage. Excuse me. What I want to do is, because our first speaker is based in California and it's about it's after 1 a.m, is we might turn over to Brian. He has a joint presentation with his colleague Elisabeth. Both of them are with the Wildlife Conservation Society. So Brian has been a senior advisor for them on their bycatch reduction initiative since 2022. He's been heavily involved in Bangladesh from about 2006. He was originally involved in providing protection, or focusing on providing protection for one of the world's largest population of threatened freshwater and coastal dolphins. That involved a lot of engagement with community and government, and resulted in establishment of protected areas in critical habitat. He's also been involved in efforts to focus on sharks and rays and sustainable fisheries and MPAs. He's been involved in research and a variety of other countries, including Cambodia, Fiji, India, Indonesia, Myanmar, Nepal, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. He's involved with IUCN's Species Survival Commission and their cetacean specialist group. He's also a member of the Society for Marine Mammal Conservation and the World Commission for Protected Areas, which is part of IUCN. Elisabeth, his colleague, is a senior manager of the Marine Conservation Program for Wildlife Conservation, for WCS, based in Bangladesh. And their aim is to discover and protect threatened marine megafauna and to inspire science-based solutions for a healthy ocean and supporting people. She works closely with national and international development partners, particularly those involved affected by climate change or the loss of biodiversity and conservation management regulations. She collaborates with government agencies to implement marine species and habitat protection plans, and is also involved in the illegal wildlife trade, well, as in combating the illegal wildlife trade. She's been has some formal training as an educator, teacher, and had a former position as a CEO of a local nature tourism company. She's also been involved in management strategies for connecting wildlife conservation with sustainable use. She's a kinship conservation fellow, trained in market-based tools for conservation and leadership, and also the regional vice chair for the Indian Ocean region of IUCN's shark specialist group. So Brian, can I hand over to you, and also to Elisabeth, and allow you to walk through your presentation, please.
Yes, thanks very much, Duncan, and thank you very much to all the organizers of the workshop. If you just give me a second to share the screen, Elisabeth and I will give the presentation. We'll kind of divvy it up into different parts. There we go. So yeah, the topic of the presentation is the demand for fish swim bladders driving the extinction of globally endangered marine wildlife. And again, it's presented by Brian Smith and Elisabeth Barney Mansur. Oops, for some reason it's not letting me scroll down. Okay, great, thank you. So Charles Darwin noted in The Origin of Species that the lungs of higher vertebrates evolved from swim bladders, but recent evidence suggests that it was the other way around, that the lungs of primitive fish evolved into swim bladders. Regardless of which came first, Darwin could never have imagined that swim bladders or maws of croaker fish sought after during his time for making condoms would someday sell for 3 times the price of gold. The trade in croaker swim bladders or maws and incidental catches in fisheries for their maws is really a global problem, with strong examples that we've been able to uncover in both Asia and Latin America. I'm not sure if people know about it, but the vaquita is a porpoise in the Gulf of California, Mexico, and it's really faced with imminent extinction. There's believed to be less than about 7 animals left, which really is not a viable population anymore. And you know, we kind of expect it to go extinct in the next few years, which is really a tragedy. And the sole threat to the driving the extinction of these animals is the demand for the Twawa fish maws that are caught in gill nets, and also catch vaquitas in the same nets. So, you know, my engagement and Elisabeth's engagement, I think, originally came from the concern about the potential impacts of the demand for fish maws and the fish maw fishery. You know, was intensifying gillnet fisheries in Bangladesh, where we have had a long research program to understand the ecology of marine wildlife, including cetaceans, sharks, rays, and marine turtles. And we gathered information as a first step with conservation partners. We led a successful motion at the World Conservation Congress in 2021 for controlling and monitoring trade in croaker swim bladders to protect both protected croakers and reduce incidental catches of threatened marine megafauna. I'll turn the presentation over to Elisabeth now, and she can tell you a little bit more about the what we found in Bangladesh in terms of fisheries for fish maw and the potential impacts on marine megafauna. Liz?
Thank you so much. Our monitoring of small-scale fisheries is based to a large extent on citizen science fishermen that work with us. These are gillnet fishermen that record their catches and fishing effort in return for increased at-sea safety. And it's very clear that in general for gillnetters, the catch is going down, the value of the catch is reducing. And so whatever comes at a higher value will drive an intensification of the fisheries. And we see that the high price of the fish maws is certainly contributing to that, which in effect, as Brian was saying, also increases the risk of threatened marine wildlife being bycaught. Next. We've seen a growth, a rapid growth in the fish maw trade. We have buyers coming in from the consumer countries to Bangladesh and taking these, ordering large quantities of them. Fish maw are generally exported together with, or often exported together with illegal products of legally protected species. So that can be mobulid gill plates or shark fins, ray fins, and potentially also skins. This trade itself has grown so strongly that the government is behind in actually monitoring the quantity and the trade routes of this. So even though there is there are customs codes, and I'm sure Stan will be talking about that later, the national monitoring of this is at a very low level. Also, in part, I should add, because a lot of the processing happens in non-licensed fish processing sites. Next. So our fishermen, citizen science fishermen, they record what they catch, including the bycaught or non-target species. And it's really of great concern to see that in the sample set here that we used to analyze this, we had a really worrying percentage of some turtles as well as rays and sharks caught in these same gill nets that caught fish species that are caught croakers valued for their maws. And what is particularly concerning, of course, is that among this marine wildlife are also critically endangered species as well as vulnerable ones. We in general have fewer reportings of cetacean catches or bycatches, I should say, for different reasons. But we do know that the habitats where these other marine megafauna are bycaught are also priority cetacean habitats. And so it's very clear that their bycatch risk is also increasing as the gillnet fishery targeting croakers or other finfish valued for their maws increases. Thank you. Next. Back to you, Brent.
Yeah. So one of the things that, our work in Bangladesh led us to have, strong concerns about the fish maw trade and its potential impacts. And we saw what happened with the Chinese bababwa that was fished out in the Yangtze River mouth in China. And then the market moved to the tochwaba in the Gulf of California. And then as that was fished out and at the expense of the vaquita, now the market, the source of croaker swim bladders is moving to other countries. And one of those countries, which we found is Bangladesh, and we started to contact colleagues, and we found out that it was really fairly widespread, ranging from Papua New Guinea to French Guiana. So this demand for the fish maw driving intensification of gillnet fisheries, and then resulting in greater entanglement rates for marine wildlife was very concerning. So we kind of led this IUCN motion, and what it did was it recommended an analysis of the impacts of the demand for and trade in fish maw on both croaker species and threat marine megafauna. The motion also supports the establishment of trade regulations on fish maws through national laws and regulations. And it also discusses a potential proposal to list further croaker species in CITES. But we know, the tochwaba has been listed in CITES Appendix 1 for many years, but that that hasn't really had the impact that we all desire. And there's already been two IUCN motions on regulating or stopping the trade in tochwaba fish maws. So IUCN motions and CITES listings, I don't think are enough. We really need to tackle the problem also where it occurs in the fisheries themselves. So, despite major efforts to save the vaquita, it's likely imminent extinction is really a powerful lesson on the potential impacts of what we call fishing down the value chain of swim bladders. So, going from the bohaba to the totuaba and now to other croaker and bony fishes. For instance, the black spotted croaker in Bangladesh, which is now commanding extraordinary high prices and leading to increases in gillnet fisheries and marine wildlife entanglements. So there's an urgent need really to investigate, how widespread the situation is in other areas where croakers and other fishes valued for their maws co-occur with threatened marine wildlife. So I think this workshop is really a great opportunity to do that. And, I really look forward to learning more from all the participants about the situation in your area. And with this, I'll turn it over to Liz to conclude the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Next. So I think we do have enough cases where we know that if we wait until species become endangered and their assessments show that the populations are declining at speeds that are very difficult to sustain, and we know that that is too late. In this case, for many of the targeted species that are valued for their maws, we still have an opportunity to actually bring about management that could protect these populations from serious declines or from disappearing altogether. One of the things I think is important is that we see the connectivity of this fisheries, be it directly targeted fisheries or an opportunistic fisheries for maws that are of value. The processing of it is, in our case, small scale, but it yields a very large gain. But from the experience with other policy developments, we also have to look at what is enforceable by the government, the relative government bodies. Brian, can you go to the next slide? And I think one of the very important things, a recent study actually by Yvonne shows that if we do not put in monitoring requirements and ones that are required at an international level, then it is very difficult to actually have any time to react and find the best management ways forward. So I think from my perspective, this is what I'm really looking forward to understanding of how best the international community can guide national governments in ensuring that this trade does not push other species of fish as well as other marine megafauna closer to extinction. Thank you so much.
Great.
I think we had, sorry, we have one more slide just, and so maybe I should just add that, controlling these, as Elisabeth said, controlling the fish maw trade and fisheries, catching, catching fishes highly valued for their maws is really an issue that links sustainable fisheries with protecting globally threatened marine megafauna. And preserving a healthy ocean for healthy people too. So if we can kind of leverage this issue and and link it to sustainable fisheries and wildlife conservation, I think it's a really important issue that people need to recognize, and this workshop is a really good first step. Thank you.
Well, fantastic. Thanks, Brian and Elisabeth, for kicking this off with such a compelling presentation. I think it really sets out in spades some of the clear management challenges which are here. I heard you mention this is small scale large gain, which I think underpins what one of the central problems is, and just the fact that even listing on CITES and trying to stop the trade hasn't really made much of an impact, certainly on the Totoaba, and obviously needs to be tackled from different perspectives. I'd like to open it up now for some questions or discussion. People have the opportunity to ask questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And Brian, Elisabeth, I think you're able to answer verbally as well as through the chat area. I've got a question from Peter Maws, who I know is based in Indonesia. Are you able to read that question, Brian and Elisabeth, or do you want me to read it out for you?
Thank you, Duncan. I can certainly take that question. I think the people that are best positioned to respond to this will be Stan and Yvonne from Hong Kong when they speak about markets and trades, specifically about species. So perhaps we could move that to there, because our presentation focused mostly on the Asian area. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. I'm still trying to get used to how I do all this. So maybe I can just ask a question verbally, and then I can work out how the written ones. What are your thoughts on why why CITES listings haven't worked? And in the case of, say, the Totoaba, is it just simply the high value just provides too much incentive to evade the law, or is the law difficult to police?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can comment a little bit on that. I mean, everything's just so out of whack, Duncan, because I mean, the incredibly high prices that, poor fishermen are getting for these Maws are just incredible. And, it's just such a windfall to catch one of these big fish that it's exceedingly difficult to control. And the situation in the Gulf of California is, the cartels have basically taken it over because, it's worth more than cocaine. So they've kind of taken it over. And, once you get that kind of level of organized crime involved, CITES really is not a very powerful instrument. CITES works best when people obey the laws, but when things just get so out of hand, like in this situation, it's quite difficult.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions? If not, I've got another 1,000 to go through because it was such an interesting presentation, but I'm happy to pass over. Anybody else looking to seek some further input?
Duncan, may I just add one more thing? I think it's important to clarify that the Totoaba is listed on Appendix 1 of CITES because of its conservation concern. And when we are talking, as the IUCN motion was referring to, it's important to remember that there's also the Appendix 2, which aims to regulate and monitor trade in species that are not yet endangered, but likely will become so if they continue to be traded at that level. And so I think when we're talking about CITES, it's really incredibly important to differentiate between the complete prohibition of trade, because the animal is really so close to extinction that it just can't take anything more. Whereas the Appendix 2 really aims to monitor and control it so that that doesn't happen. So just for people that are perhaps not as familiar with the CITES regulations, I think that's important to mention.
Yeah, thanks, Elisabeth. I think it's good to get a good understanding of all of the details with this. So just one more question, if I may. So you focused on croakers and gillnets. but when you do a bit of a Google search on what's for sale in Bangladesh, there's a whole bunch of other species, and I'm just wondering what might be the other key species that are involved in this trade, and is it just the gillnet fisheries?
Yeah, maybe I'll let Liz provide some of the more details, but one of the things that I would say is that the croakers and the groupers tend to be the more valuable ones. Those are the ones, there's sort of like a big divergence. There's the really super high value swim bladders that are selling for extraordinary high prices. And then there's other swim bladders that are used for things like sutures and other products that are of value, but not, they don't have that extraordinary kind of windfall value that croakers and groupers do. Liz, do you want to add to that in terms of the species involved?
Yeah, I think it's important to look at how, again, here, the valuable species or the species valued for Maws also drives the market for the less valuable ones. So I just put up a link where you can see this is a commercial website that sells Maws, and it's a beautiful, we often use it in trainings because you can actually see the different species and their value as well. So it's a very wide variety in terms of species, but also quality, shapes and sizes, and of course, end use and end prices as well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so if nobody has any other further questions, I can't see. Oh, hang on, it looks like there might be another one. Yeah. So Matthew, sorry, I needed to scroll down. So Matthew Farthing had a question for you. Do one of you want to tackle that question, please?
Yeah, well, I mean, I could say, addressing the question, I mean, it didn't do a whole lot of good for the vaquita. So as far as that goes, again, the problem is that when you have a product that's just so valuable, it makes it really, really difficult, public pressure be damned. I mean, really, there was a lot of public pressure in terms of to conserve the vaquita. It did indeed unlock a large range of tools in terms of their conservation, but it clearly was not enough. And part of the reason, at least in my opinion, is that much of the emphasis was on sort of developing policies, international policies to pressure Mexico. Well, what really needed to happen was more sort of on the ground type of conservation and working with communities. I know that was done, and it was really difficult. But perhaps the emphasis was more on CITES and IUCN motions rather than on the ground action.
Okay, well, again, many thanks, and Brian, you're a legend for being up so late. So hopefully you make your 8 o'clock meeting tomorrow. Elisabeth, also, thank you very much. Been really interesting to hear about, particularly this ongoing interaction across the world. It's not just the Totoaba vaquita, but there's obviously quite a lot of other interactions that are worrying across other parts of the world as well. Nadia, are we able to load up the next presentation, please? Our next presentation, while Nadia is getting that loaded, is a video. So it was from Claire Gorman. So Claire is with she worked with the IUCN Marine Biodiversity Unit for several years. She's headquartered at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia in the US. She earned her master's at ODU, where she studied the extinction risk of cyanids. She's the Red List Coordinator for the Sciaenidae Red List Authority and is currently working as an environmental engineer for the Virginia Marine Resources Commission. But her presentation is on with her IUCN hat on. So I'll hand it over to you, Nadia, and Claire provides her apologies for not being available to do this at this particular time of the day.
Everyone, my name is Claire Gorman. Thank you all for your time and attention today. I apologize that I could not attend this workshop synchronously, but I will be presenting a brief overview of the global conservation status of the family Sciaenidae and their role in the mall trade. First, I'll give a brief introduction to the family of croaker and drum, and then I'll go over our red list results where we looked at extinction risk for the family as a whole, and then I'll discuss some of the results we found in our Maws study. Taxonomically complex group. This is a relatively large family with about 300 species, approximately 26 of which are restricted to freshwater. Cyanids possess a wide variety of external features within some genera, and this can often require the use of the swim bladder for accurate species identification. Sometimes the swim bladder can be difficult to remove without destroying it or the specimen, which can make identification even more of a challenge. The marine species in this family are generally demersal and inhabit shallow continental shelf waters of the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans, and most of the freshwater species occur in the Amazon River basin. Many species in this family form large spawning aggregations and are estuarine dependent. And while many species in the family are small and fast-growing, there are several large-bodied and long-lived species. Some can attain up to 2 meters in length and can live up to 60 years of age. One of the unique characteristics of cyanids is their use of sonic muscles that surround their swim bladder, which they use to produce croaking and drumming sounds, which they are most well known for. Species in this family are targeted in commercial, recreational, and artisanal fisheries all over the world. One of the more unique markets for cyanids, at least for some species, is the international mall trade. As most of you probably already know, maw is a dried swim bladder, and the swim bladder is an organ used for buoyancy control, and in cyanids is used for communication in some cases. The images on the left here are of fresh swim bladders, and on the right are maw products. On a commercial scale, maw is used to produce isinglass, which is a clarifier for beer and wine. However, this method of clarifying is becoming less popular. But more importantly, maw is also considered a delicacy in many countries in Southeast Asia and is believed to have medicinal benefits in some cases. It is also used as a beauty product and is sometimes kept as an investment product if the maw is of particularly high value. The size of the maw is an important characteristic, and larger maw generally come from larger species. In addition to size, other characteristics that can affect the price are the species, sex, age, wild versus farmed, the country of origin, and the thickness of the maw. Some maw are highly valued and can be marketed for over $1,000 a kilogram. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. For those of you who are not familiar with the IUCN stands for the International Union for Conservation of Nature. This is an international conservation organization with a vision of a just world that values nature and has the goals of encouraging international collaboration and promoting conservation action. The IUCN Red List of Threatened Species was established in 1964, and it's the world's most comprehensive information source for extinction risk. It's based on the best available scientific data, and it's used to inform and analyze status, trends, and threats to biodiversity. There are 9 red list categories into which a species can be placed. I won't go into too much detail here, but I will run through each category quickly. And so starting from the bottom of the figure, the vast majority of species globally have not been evaluated and are designated as such. Data deficient is for species that do not have adequate information to determine an appropriate category or that may have taxonomic issues. The remaining categories show an increasing risk of extinction from least concern to extinct. Least concern is for species that do not meet the criteria for threatened status. Near threatened is reserved for species that do not quite meet the criteria for a threatened category, but do come close or are likely to qualify in the future. Critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable are the threatened categories, and these are the species with the highest extinction risk. In this study and throughout this talk, I will be referring to elevated concern species or species of elevated concern, which includes critically endangered, endangered, vulnerable, and near threatened species. I will also be using this same color scheme throughout the presentation with the warmer colors representing higher risk. This figure shows the number of cyanids in each red list category. On the x-axis are the number of species, and on the y-axis are the red list categories. The majority of cyanids were assessed as least concern, making up about 65% of species, and over a quarter did not have sufficient data for an appropriate red list category and were assessed as data deficient. Although elevated concern species make up about 7% of the species in the family, the best estimate for the proportion of elevated concern species is actually about 10% and could be as high as 35%. This accounts for the uncertainty in the true status of those assessed as data deficient. The majority of species in threatened and the near threatened categories have experienced population decline. So for reference, this 10% is relatively low compared to other commercially important marine bony fish groups like tunas and billfishes, which is around 18%, groupers around 26%, and sea breams and porgies around 17%. But it is similar to that of forage fishes around 10% as well, and puffers around 8%. The larger proportion of data deficient species is higher than the previously mentioned groups, the tunas, groupers, and sea breams, but it is similar to that of forage fishes. We wanted to know what the primary threats to the family were. Like in the previous figure, the x-axis is the number of species, and on the left is each major threat. This includes both freshwater and marine species. Overexploitation was the primary threat to the family overall, and pollution was the next major threat. Overexploitation is typically the primary threat to marine bony fishes, so this was expected. Pollution being a prominent threat to this family does make sense, given their proclivity for coastal and estuarine habitats. Then we wanted to know if the maw trade is a driver of risk in the family specifically. So for the maw study, in total, we were able to identify 29 cyanid species used in the trade. This included species that were mislabeled and marketed as a different species. I mentioned earlier, often the swim bladder is used in species identification for some cyanids. However, after the swim bladder is processed, it often distorts the characteristics of the bladder and makes species identification challenging, if not impossible in some cases. On the left here, you can see an unprocessed Totoaba swim bladder, and on the right is a maw from the same species. As you can see, they look very different, and the size and shape are drastically altered. And because of this, sometimes species that are more common or readily available, they'll be marketed as more valuable or desirable species unbeknown to the customer. The naming system for maw is not species specific, which adds to the difficulty in proper identification. Researchers have started using molecular tools to elucidate what species are actually being marketed, and hopefully we'll see more of these types of studies moving forward. And this will help in the effort to understand the full species composition of the trade. 29 species we identified in our survey, only 16 had retail price data available, and all of them had length data. I included price data for non-cyanid species and groups in the study as well. This includes eels, perch, puffer, snapper, threadfin, and a cusk eel. Overall, cyanids were more highly valued than non-cyanid groups. And then from here, we compared the red list categories for maw and non-maw trade cyanids. When comparing the maw and non-maw trade species, we found that the proportion of elevated concern species was much higher in the maw trade group. The best estimate for elevated concern species in the maw group is about 35% and is only about 7% for the non-maw trade group. Both groups had about 25% of species assessed as data deficient. While the list of maw trade species is certainly not exhaustive, this is a strong indication that the maw trade could be a driver of extinction risk in cyanids. This is a standard box plot with minimum value, maximum value, interquartile range, median, and outliers of maximum maw prices available. On the x-axis are the red list categories, and on the y-axis are the maximum prices. Price is an important parameter when it comes to maw because it can act as a sort of gauge for which species are most desirable or rare. Across all species for which at least one retail price was found, the maximum price ranged from $39 a kilogram to $80,000 a kilogram. The maximum prices for critically endangered species were generally higher than those in other categories, followed by data deficient species. The sample sizes were very small for vulnerable and near threatened species. Together, these species commanded $1,000 a kilogram to $5,000 a kilogram. So after looking at price versus red list category, we looked at length versus category. As I mentioned earlier, length is an important factor because larger bodied species have larger maw, and size is an important characteristic when it comes to price. This is a violin plot of maximum length for all species in the family where available. Again, the x-axis has the red list categories and the y-axis has the maximum length. For each category, there is a traditional box plot. The shaded region is a probability density function where the width of the violin corresponds to the frequency of each value. So as you can see, we can see a similar pattern here. Species of elevated concern are generally larger, followed by data deficient species. The median of elevated concern species was about 4 times larger than that of least concern and data deficient species. Least concern species were generally the smallest. This suggests that larger bodied species are at higher risk than smaller species, and this is a pattern that we've seen in other bony fish groups like the groupers, sea breams, and tunas. Next, we looked at the length distributions between maw and non-maw trade species. Generally, species in the maw trade were bigger, with about 90% of non-maw trade species having a maximum size less than the median of those in the maw trade. Given the high proportion of elevated concern cyanids used in the trade and that larger cyanids were more likely to be elevated concern, the size distributions between the maw and non-maw trade species was expected. So then we looked at all 3 parameters together: body length, price, and red list category. On the left here is a figure from Collette et al. 2011, where they looked at ex-vessel market price and generation length in tunas and billfishes. As you can see, there's a pretty clear correlation between market value, generation length, and extinction risk category. This was the pattern that we were expecting to see in our results. These are ours on the right, and few clear patterns emerged. This plot has a maximum size along the x-axis, a maximum price on the y-axis, and each data point represents one species and is color-coded according to red list category. The pattern of large size and high value are correlated with higher extinction risk for some, but not all species. Now I'm going to go over a few specific examples of species that did and did not follow the expected pattern and possible reasons why. Two species that stood out and followed the general pattern we were expecting to see were the Totoaba and Chinese Bahaba. These 2 species represent the higher end of the pattern with high value, large size, and elevated concern. I will note here that the Totoaba has since been assessed as vulnerable. Highly valued cyanids in the maw trade that have experienced population decline as a result. Both species have relatively restricted ranges, with the totoaba occurring in the Gulf of California and the Chinese bahaba restricted to waters off southern China. They both have large body sizes, attaining up to 200 centimeters in length. The bahaba is a protected species and was severely overfished, making large individuals extremely rare. Since the decline in availability of bahaba, the totoaba has replaced it as the most desirable species for Maws. Totoaba has been listed under Appendix 1 of CITES, meaning it cannot be traded internationally. The size and rarity of these species make them increasingly valuable, which is concerning since they are both currently assessed as threatened on the IUCN Red List. Here are a few more examples. The large yellow croaker is a critically endangered species, but its value was relatively low. Although the wild population of this species has experienced significant population decline, it is cultivated in China, which keeps prices low. These farmed products are generally considered to be lower quality and are more widely available than the preferred wild-caught products. Among species listed as least concern, Louw esquimosa is a medium-sized species that had relatively high value. While the reason for this is unclear, it could be the result of species misidentification. The range of prices for squimosa was highly variable and could include other species. On the other hand, the meager is a much larger species, one of the larger species in the family, in fact, but it has the lowest retail value. Initially, I didn't really understand why the price for this species was so low, but while this species is large, the swim bladder is actually considered to be rough, not smooth, which is a very desirable characteristic in the Maws market. Overall, this study highlighted a few important data gaps. There was a large portion of data deficient species in the family overall, and this was consistent between Maws and non-Maws trade groups. This underscores the need for additional study of this family, especially given that the data deficient species were larger and more valuable in the Maws trade than least concerned species. Taxonomic clarification and addressing issues of unreported bycatch are vital to better understanding the true status of the data deficient species. In regard to the Maws trade, we still do not know the full species composition. While we were able to compile a pretty thorough list, it is certainly not exhaustive. Elucidating the full composition of the trade will rely heavily on molecular studies, given the difficulty in Maws identification. Additionally, many species in the trade did not have price data available. It's important to have an understanding of the market prices because as larger and more desirable species become less available, the trade will turn to other readily available species. While we don't know what they are or what they will be, they are likely to be the next largest species, and having a gauge of price will give us some insight into this. Given the difficulty in identification of Maws after processing and the general secretiveness of the trade, management and regulation are very difficult. We do have the tools to learn more about this wildlife trade, we just need to know where to implement them. Despite these data gaps, we were able to draw some important conclusions. Overexploitation is the primary threat to cyanids. This is notable despite the large proportion of least concern in data deficient species. Over 150 cyanids are threatened by exploitation, and while the majority of species were assessed as least concern, this could change in the future if current trends persist. As we have seen in other commercially important bony fish groups, large-bodied species are at a higher risk. Given that data deficient species are also generally larger than least concern species, this is a cause for concern and suggests that at least some of the data deficient species are likely threatened, but we just do not have the supporting data. The results of this study indicate that the Maws trade is likely a driver of risk in the family. Although a small proportion of species in the family are used in the trade, the high proportion of elevated concern species compared to the family overall is a cause for concern. So with that, I would like to thank everyone who was involved with this project. A very big thank you to the Sciaenidae RLA who offered their expertise and guidance. Without them, this project would not have been possible. Many thanks to the 100+ assessors who gave their time and expertise to the cyanid assessments and provided very useful data. Thank you to our funding sources, UMT, BioAmazonia, and the National Aquarium. And thank you, Duncan, very much for the opportunity to participate in this important workshop. Thank you all very much for your time and attention to this important topic, and please feel free to contact me with any follow-up questions or inquiries. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure you'll agree it was a really interesting presentation from Claire, and certainly started to dig into a lot more detail about the nature of the trade and what makes that particular family of fish more vulnerable, with some interesting details that need to be teased out, such as rough versus smooth swim bladders. Just wondering whether anybody has any comments or wanted to post a question for others who are involved in the webinar. We're quite ahead of time at this stage, and so there's an opportunity for some interaction on this, and also maybe further questions for Brian and Elisabeth. So please use. Oh, hang on, we've got a question. Yeah, sorry, just a comment. Thanks, Rekha, for the compliment for Claire's presentation. Yeah, does anybody have any questions or comments about either Claire's presentation, or we've still got, I think, Brian and Elisabeth here if you want to raise any questions there about as well to them as well.
Duncan,
Yes.
there's another question from Matthew just above. Oh, there's a few questions coming up.
Okay. Oh yeah. Okay.
In the Q&A. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, but Yvonne answered it. Yvonne and Jeff. Okay.
Yeah. So Matthew, did the answers help your question, or the other things you needed to explore? Okay. So Rekha, there are some other species and species groups being covered in further presentations, both today and tomorrow. Yannicka, maybe that's something that would be good to prepare, is a sort of map of the species and the species trade and the issues, just to get a sense of the global nature of things. Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm just sort of looking at some of the chat which has been going on in the chat box and making some notes. Certainly buying and selling prices is a topic of conversation. Probably be more on this over the next couple of days. Identification, I know we definitely have a presentation on that tomorrow, but I think it may be particularly difficult to have one based upon the sort of visual side of things, but I'm happy to be corrected on that. There was also a question about farming and fish more from farming. There's certainly sources of supply. Here in Australia, I was at a processing plant in Melbourne a couple of months ago, and they were processing farmed barramundi, and the fish maw had already been removed before the fish was being sent to processing for human food down at the factory that I visited. Certainly, there are sturgeon farms in the US which sell fish maw, and there's probably other ones as well. It's an area that requires some research. Our next presentation is going to be from Simone. Simone works for Traffic in South Africa. As I mentioned earlier, she was part of our steering committee and been really helpful source of advice, and also a part of the world which I don't have much experience with. So really looking forward to your presentation, Simone. And yeah, I might turn it over to you to lead the way. Thank you. Oh, you might want to introduce yourself. I didn't get a bio from you, sorry.
Really, I sent it over, but it's fine. Yeah, but let me open up my presentation.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm Simone Louw. I've been working with traffic for the past 4 years now. Yeah, and a lot of my work is focused on marine fisheries, particularly high value products from Africa to Asia. And yeah, I've recently, for the past since 2020, I've been focusing quite a bit on fish maws. And yeah, I'll be talking about the project that we've been busy doing here in South Africa and in Cameroon as well, and how we're planning to expand that to a number of other countries in Africa. Okay, so this project is called the Building Knowledge on the Fish Maw Trade from Africa to Asia. And it's been funded by the Paul Angle Family Foundation. Yeah, so just some background on why we started this research. As many of you might know, East Africa is probably the only region where there has been published information on the fish maw trade in Africa. The Nile perch from Lake Victoria. There was a number of published information based on Yvonne's work on the DNA analysis in the Hong Kong markets, and I think there was a really great report done by GIZ where they looked at the supply chain and the illegal harvesting that's happening in Lake Victoria. So there we know that Nile perch was being targeted and harvested, and I know Yvonne's going to talk a bit about that more tomorrow. So then what we did is we looked at other countries in Africa, where else are fish maws being sourced from, and we basically looked at Hong Kong's import data for all African countries, and we saw that the number of countries that Hong Kong is sourcing their maws from has been increasing. It increased from 23 source countries in 2015 to about 36 countries by 2020. And that was cause for concern from us, as we didn't have any, there was no published information on what species they were taking these maws from, and particularly marine species that were being harvested. And also, yeah, there's no regulatory framework for fish maws. A lot of people, a lot of officials and fisheries managers don't even know what fish maws are. So yeah, huge gap on the African continent, and we decided we wanted to start finding out, you know, what's been happening. So another thing that also came across our radar, and as was mentioned before, was that fish maws also been associated with the transport of other illicit wildlife products. What we find here in South Africa is that a lot of fish maws are being seized along with abalone and seahorses. Yeah, and fish maws are also being used, the broad trade terms are also being used as a cover to transport other products. And because officials aren't aware, there's minimal trade controls, these consignments aren't being checked before they leave these source countries. So just an example, in February 2017, there was about 1,066 kilograms of pangolin scales that was packed into 22 containers that was bound for Laos. And this shipment was labeled as fish maws, and it was coming from DRC that was routed via Nairobi. Yeah, there was another incident in 2017. Again, pangolin scales that was uncovered in Malaysia, with a shipment coming from the Republic of Congo, and it was also labeled as fish maws. So yeah, this has been seen as well with sea horses and shark fins. There was an arrest made in Hong Kong where the officials found 140 kilograms of sea horses and 220 kilograms of shark fins that were also declared as fish maws. And then upon further investigations, I think those officials arrested 2 directors of a dried seafood shop that it was destined for. So yeah, so fish maws, because people aren't aware, these consignments are being labeled and they're not being checked under these fish maw codes. So awareness, I think, is quite a big thing going forward, especially for officials. We've had quite a few seizures in South Africa, more recently, just 2 weeks ago. And these officials, they find the fish maws, they've never seen it before, they don't know what it looks like. Yeah, so a lot of the times they just let these things go, or yeah. So we've been working quite a bit with the officials. We try to get these seized products and we do DNA analysis on them as well to try and identify. And that's partly linked to this project that we've started. So 3 main objectives of this project is to first identify what species are being harvested through DNA analysis, and then understand the trade dynamics. So we look at supply chain analysis, we try and do market surveys and interviews, and then also customs data analysis, looking at the imports and exports, trade routes, etc. And what we've also started doing now is we're monitoring e-commerce sites to identify company names and locations and contact details, and try and get a distribution of, okay, they're being caught on the coastline, but perhaps they're being processed inland and being exported from specific harbors. And then, yeah, the third objective is to develop a strategy for future work in the management and conservation of those marine species associated with the trade. So I'll just give a brief overview of some of the results that we have found initially in our year in South Africa. So based on DNA analysis that we've done, kingclip Genipterus capensis has been identified as swim bladders that are being, as maws that are being traded here from South Africa. This was also confirmed by the Department of Fisheries, as there are 10 companies that are exporting kingclip bladders from South Africa, and these companies have permits. And then, so kingclip it's a popular eating fish here in South Africa. It's commercially important due to its high market value. These species are primarily caught as bycatch in the Hague-directed demersal longline fishery, which is an MSC certified fishery. And yeah, kingclip populations. So we weren't really alarmed by kingclip because these populations are harvested fairly sustainable levels. But another species that is not confirmed yet through DNA analysis, but this is cob. And this was through our investigations, a number of fishermen mentioned it, traders as well mentioned cob, but we haven't been able to find concrete evidence. And cob is also an important species that is caught in our recreational, subsistence and commercial line fisheries. The juveniles are restricted to estuaries and they're targeted by surfstone anglers. And yeah, the adults are often found beyond the reef and surf zones, where they are an easy target for commercial ski boat fishermen. And there has also been some evidence that suggests there's specific targeting of spawning aggregations by ski boat fishermen at night in KwaZulu-Natal. So cob was a bit of a concern for us because these stocks, is indication that these stocks are heavily depleted due to overfishing, and also based on that IUCN resolution on croakers. So this is something that we actually trying to find a lot more information on and trying to find more evidence on, and to understand, how is carp being targeted here in South Africa. However, we have found that there is quite a lot of secrecy around this trade and unwillingness to share information, particularly from the processing factories and the traders here in South Africa. I'm not sure. I'll be very interested to hear how other people have found how it's been, talking to people within the supply chain. Here in South Africa, I think because the trade is so linked to abalone and the value, and because this product is going to the same markets as abalone, there's a lot more secrecy. One of the processing factories told me that they were threatened before. So they don't talk about it easily. It's hard to get information. And because abalone is so highly linked to organized crime here in South Africa, people are just scared to share information, despite the fact that, there's actually no regulations around the trade. So, besides how the fish are caught, they can trade them. But yeah, so that has been a challenge, but the next step of this project is to try and find out what is happening with carp. So looking at the e-commerce monitoring, this was also an interesting part of the investigation. So we looked at Alibaba and 21 Food. And we basically tried to identify the vendors and the locations of where they were, contact details, names, and then also try to see what species they mentioned. So on these e-commerce sites, they mentioned eelfish as well, so Maws from eelfish, catfish, and tilapia. And Durban Harbour was highlighted as the main port of exit, which is, I think, also very important information, as Durban Harbour here in South Africa, it's not well monitored, and it is noted as one of our main ports where a lot of illegality takes place. So this map just shows the distribution of the trading companies advertising fish moors based on the provinces. Majority of the trading companies are here in Johannesburg, followed by some in Cape Town, and then up along the East Coast, and then Durban. But the large majority was all within Joburg, which I found very interesting. Oops. And then, we also looked at customs data analysis. So a lot of what we do is we look at import and export discrepancies. But so this information was based on the HS codes from Comtrade, which is not very specific. It does include heads and tails, but we just wanted to try and see what are the destinations that fish moors are being traded to. So 93% of South Africa's fish moor products were imported by East Asia, which is not a surprise, mostly from Hong Kong, and then Macau, and Singapore as well. And of these countries, South Africa is only reporting exports to Hong Kong. Otherwise, there was no exports to Singapore or Macau. And then some of these other destinations that's going into Southern Africa, I also found quite interesting, because that's quite a common trend with abalone, where abalone is being traded through it's getting exported out to Southern African countries, and then from there it gets re-exported out. So I think it's following similar patterns as what's been happening with abalone. So this looked at Hong Kong's specific data. So Hong Kong has more, the Hong Kong Census and Statistics Department has more specific codes to, so it's just dried fish moors. And I basically just looked at the monthly imports of fish maws from South Africa between 2015 and 2021, because this was mentioned also by traders that they will stock up on the fish maws and then export it just before the Chinese New Year's or a couple of months beforehand. So yeah, as you can see, I mean, September stands out as the highest, and then it decreases a bit over October, November. Yeah, and I think that's in preparation as they're preparing for those festivals. They start exporting it just before when the demand is a bit high, and then the prices can go a bit up. So as I said, raising awareness for law enforcement, I think is quite a big thing. So we've been doing some sensitizing workshop, trying to show officials what maws look like, what they're commonly traded with. So yeah, we found here in South Africa that a lot of them are being seized, and in a number of African countries where these products are traded along with shark fins and seahorses and so on. So just making them aware of what is going on and the potential down the line. So yeah, I'm going to just touch on what we did in Cameroon. So in Cameroon, we did some market surveys in Douala and Kribi. I'm not sure how I'm going on for time, but I'll go through these a bit quicker. So yeah, in Kribi, we started out in Kribi fish markets. They use these dugout wooden boats or canoes, and the fishing method, they call it waka waka, but they're basically drift nets. And it's a well-organized fish market. We went around with a market official, which really helped us to gain more respect. The fishermen were more open to talking to us quite a bit. And yeah, I just added there that the highest fishing activity took place between 6 a.m. and 12 p.m. After that, it was very hard to get any information from the fishermen. So yeah, in Cameroon, 2 species were identified where the swim bladders were being removed from the African threadfin. It was known locally as capitaine, and then also the cassava croaker, which was locally known as bar pressaline. So yeah, sorry, the video does work. So this was at the Kribi fish market. Yeah, we can just see them removing the swim bladder. And then from here, they will pass it off. So this was, yeah, so the Cameroonian fishermen come in, they land their stock, and then they remove the swim bladders very quickly, and then they just hand it off to, it will most likely be a Nigerian businessman. So that we found an interesting dynamic, that it was mainly Nigerians that were buying these buying the swim bladders from the Cameroonian fishermen. Yeah, as was mentioned before, so the value of the swim bladder depended on the size and the thickness, and they mentioned that male bladders were preferred over female bladders. And something I found very interesting was that they, this picture here on the left, so here he was showing us that they called it a fake swim bladder. So sometimes the swim bladder, it loosed bigger and it became very soft and powdery. So then they wouldn't end up using that. And that mainly happened with the thread fin swim bladders, whereas the cassava croakers, they always had value with the croaker swim bladders, while sometimes it came out like that from the thread fins, and they wouldn't be able to sell it at all. So this was just some of the prices that we got from the fishermen. So this was the price at the first point in the supply chain, when they sold it to the Nigerian businessmen. So for the thread fins, yeah, a 200 gram swim bladder would be up to 25 USD, whereas a 2 kilogram swim bladder would go up to 140 USD. So the price was sometimes either the same as the fish or it was a bit higher. And for croakers, a 200 kilogram swim bladder went up to 16 USD. So as I said, with the thread fin, so yeah, you can see here the thread fin, they actually got higher prices compared to the croaker. But with the thread fin, they didn't always sell the swim bladder because it sometimes would lose vigor and they wouldn't be able to sell it. Whereas with croakers, they could always sell the swim bladders. So the next market we went to was laundry plunge. And over here again, so the Nigerians started the business here approximately 15 years ago. And they bought the fishermen boats and gear specifically to go out for and target those, the African threadfin and the croakers for the swim bladders. And then the fishermen would sell the bladders to them at a fixed price. So they couldn't negotiate their prices at all. And in this market, they would sell on average the swim bladders for 80 USD. And afterwards, we went to Douala, which is the main area in Cameroon. So this is a Yokwe market, which is quite a big market. It's very busy, it's very fast. And over here, it was very interesting. So we got white coats to walk around, and they would call us fish doctors. And in essence, they respected us more when we had that white coat, and they would talk to us more easily. And I mean, we were dealing with the swim bladders, so they believed us. So yeah, it was Cameroonian fishers doing the fishing, and then Nigerian or Ghanaian that were buying the swim bladders from the fishermen. So in Cameroon, the thread fins, so it was a bit, the prices were a bit higher in Yopwe compared to Kribi. It was about 105 USDs for 200 kilograms, 200 grams, sorry, and 1 kilogram swim bladder was up to 325 US dollars, whereas the croakers, it reached 65 USD. So yeah, it's just another video of them removing the swim bladder. So what I found interesting was not everyone were removing the swim bladders from the thread fins. So it was a very small market. Everyone was catching thread fins, but not all the fishermen knew that, or new buyers that they could sell the swim bladders to. And the fishermen that did know, they were keeping it to themselves. So this fisherman, he allowed me to take this video of him. But normally what they would do is they would remove it in secret, and like if you didn't look properly, then you wouldn't actually see that they were doing this. So they're keeping it very quiet. I think they want to keep the market quite small, and they don't want other fishermen to know. Or maybe the fishermen just haven't found buyers, so they aren't removing it. Yeah, so just some interesting notes from Cameroon. So yeah, some fishermen in Kribi and Douala mentioned removing swim bladders from higher value Maws, the large thread fins, before they throw. So yeah, so they would remove the swim bladders at sea, and then they would throw the rest of the fish out if they believe that transporting the fish would be difficult and it stops them from catching more fish. So that was something that we noted. Not all of them mentioned it, but some did mention, you know, they would get the big thread fins and only take the swim bladders out and just discard the rest of the fish. But I don't think it's a common practice, because they do eat the meat as well. Many fishermen believe that the swim bladders are used in surgical operations for treating wounds and medicine. rather than, you know, it going for consumption as the big dried seafood products. And then, yeah, as I said, not all fishermen know about the business. Some thread fins were being sold without the swim bladders being removed, and we think this is keep it for less, make it so that there's less competition. And something that we also found very interesting, so the fishermen told us that prior to COVID, either the fishermen could process the swim bladders themselves, or if they sold the swim bladder to the Nigerian resellers, they would process the swim bladders. But now, after COVID, the Chinese buyers have asked them only for the fresh swim bladders because they weren't happy with how the swim bladders were being processed. So they essentially cut that part out the supply chain, and they're only buying the fresh swim bladders now from them. And yeah, I just added here customs training. This is something that we would like to do with officials in Cameroon, as there's 0 exports reported from Cameroon whatsoever. Either they're not picking it up, or they don't know about the fishmeal trade whatsoever. But yeah, there are imports. There's data coming from Hong Kong that there are imports, but yeah, there's no exports reported. So yeah, what we're planning to do next, so we're planning to do a bit more further investigations based on the gaps identified here in Cameroon, in South Africa and in Cameroon. So what we want to do in Cameroon is, because we didn't get a chance to target the final step in the supply chain, actually talking to the Chinese buyers before things get exported. So that's something we want to try and identify, and also to see the prevalence of whether they are removing swim bladders and discarding the fish at sea. So those gaps we're trying to fill, and then also expand this work to, we're going to be going to Senegal, Republic of Congo, and Madagascar to see. Madagascar was chosen because all of these countries are within the top 10 source countries that Hong Kong's importing their Maws from. And we chose Madagascar as well to try and see maybe what's happening on the Indian Ocean side of the coastline, because we've targeted quite heavily the Atlantic. Yeah, and then we're also going to go to Hong Kong to do some market surveys there and see what's happening. So yeah, thank you so much. It's just thanks again to our donors and everyone that we've consulted with and worked with along the way. Thanks.
That's great, Simone. Really, thank you for that, and also thanks for your help in getting this all together. There's already a few themes starting to appear here. It's also interesting, some of the species which are shared here with Australia. At least in terms of the genus, like the kingclip, and also your what you call cob and we call mulloway, which we'll hear about more on Thursday. I don't know whether everyone saw a note that that Liberty has changed the way that we can interact, rather than just using the chat area. It's possible to raise your hand and ask a question directly. So you're going to be the experiment for this, Simone. So I can't see everybody who's logged in. So I think Liberty's monitoring that. So either ask questions through the chat area, or if you want to ask a question directly, just put up your hand and we can hand over the microphone, so to speak. So while people are having I think, Simone, I'm kind of interested in I was contacted by a colleague of mine from the US today. We had a bit of a chat. He's doing some work on the illegal wildlife trade. It's kind of interesting how A, there's overlap, but B, some things are being sold under the badge of something else. I think you mentioned pangolin scales. But is it based on price? So the highest value item is the one which is hidden in the package, or is it the highest value item is the one that appears on the list of what's being exported?
That's interesting. That's an interesting question, actually. From what we understood was fish maws were being used as a cover because those consignments weren't being checked. So it wasn't based on price. But that would be, I think, something to check, because I mean, these were all high value products, shark fins, pangolin scales. So yeah, based on whether, because perhaps, I mean, if it is labeled as fish maws, then, you know, it could, yeah, it has a higher value as well. But yeah, from our understanding, it was just based on the fact that those consignments weren't checked, and because of the minimal trade controls, aside from Totowaba, that is, you know, there are regulations, but yeah, in Africa, none. So those consignments weren't being checked until it got to the end, the final destination.
Okay. Apparently we've got a question from Matthew Farthing. So Matthew, I think Liberty is going to unmute you, and then please go ahead.
Thanks, Duncan. Can everybody hear me? Hello?
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Hi, Simone. Sorry, you know that I have a
Matthew.
particular interest in carp in South Africa and the role the Maw trade might play in that. But I'm always so fascinated to hear about the role, like how intertwined the Maw trade in South Africa is with the illegal abalone trade, which we know is a dangerous game where we're from. Yeah. But the fact that Maw is not an illegal product in South Africa as it stands. So I guess I wanted to ask you whether you thought there was any merit to kind of trying to formalize the Maw trade in South Africa and bring it into the light and take it away from, well, you'd never take it all away, but try and create a legal channel for it to exist. And I know there's a double-edged sword, because I don't think the carp stocks in South Africa could cope with increased demand for their Maw. But you know, given how impossible it is to control the illegal abalone trade, which basically operates with impunity in South Africa, do you think that there'd be any merit to trying to formally regulate the Maw trade in South Africa, and whether or not creating a legal channel would help us kind of at least gain better control of what's going on? I know that might be a difficult question to answer, but I'm just keen to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you can look at it from so many different angles, but I think from where we stand in, for example, I think with Kingklip, I think putting regulations in place to start off with, because at the moment it still is fairly undercover. Not a lot of people know about it. It's very few processing factories, very few traders. So I think regulation could be a way forward. But in saying that, I have been in doing this research. I have been warned quite a lot by a number of marine biologists and scientists that, you know, we should be very careful with the way in which we do this work and publishing this information, just because of the sensitivities with abalone. And you know, we don't have a control over abalones, so they think it's going to head in the same direction with fish maws. Yeah, I didn't really answer your question. It's tough with such a high value product. You don't know, because you don't know what others think. I mean, you wouldn't also want to stimulate the market in the process. So yeah, I'm not sure at this point.
Thanks, Simone. I'm very sympathetic. You know, you were talking about that seizure recently I think you were talking about maybe the one in Cape Town, where, you know, the lack of awareness about what fish maw is meant that, you know, officials sort of they were of the opinion that it might have even been cuttlefish, you know, in this bag full of maw.
Yeah.
So on one hand, you want to raise the awareness, but On the other hand, you might just create the market. So yeah, I appreciate that was an impossible question to ask, but thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. Simone, there's a question in the chat area from CU Lamb. So just wondering what your thoughts are on that, please.
Yeah, so Kribi is it's a smaller fishing town much further down the coastline. So Douala is the main port. It has the much bigger market. So we assume that the prices were a lot higher in Douala because it's much bigger market. It's where the main buyers are. Kribi was very small, and there was a lot more. There's more negotiations that happens in Douala compared to Kribi. As I said, the Nigerian buyers that started the business there in Kribi, there was no negotiations with them. They decided the price of the swim bladders that they were buying from the fishermen. So and Douala, there's a lot more competition. It's a lot bigger, so I think they could negotiate the prices a lot more compared to in Kribi.
Okay, thanks, Simone. There was a general question earlier from, I think, Yifu Wang, and we've had an offer from, I'm sorry if I can't pronounce people's names, so please forgive me, Sir Bayin Lin. You said you would be able to help with an answer to that question, so happy to give the microphone to you. We can't hear you, Brian. He may be having some technical problems. We'll come back to that. We've got a sort of open discussion later. Does anybody have any more questions for Simone?
Hello.
Ah, here he is.
Hello. Can you hear me, Duncan?
Yes, we can now. Thank you.
Yeah, for this is Brian, and yeah, for the correct species identification of the fish maw in the market, yeah, we have already done it, and at least from now on, based on our experience, yes, we can ID the fish maw into for some species for some fish maws into species level, but a lot of species like the catfish only to family level or like order level. Yeah, am I answer the question?
If you're wondering, if that provides some help for your question, then I mean, it sounds like it's the ID question is a pretty big one, and I think you guys are exploring this a bit more tomorrow.
Yes, I will share a lot about the identification of fish maw with you guys tomorrow, and with a lot of details. So I think we can talk a lot of it tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. If we don't have any more questions or comments for Simone, then we can move on.
Yes, looks fine. Thank you, Duncan.
Okay, thanks, Liberty. So we're just changing gears a little bit. We're still looking at the market side. I got interested in this in part because my wife is from a winemaking family, and I was aware that fish maws were used for making isinglass, and isinglass is used in the making of some beers and wines. So I thought I would dig into this a little bit further. So I just want to run through a little bit of what I found out in the preparation for this workshop, because I think it's maybe a hidden issue and certainly something that shouldn't be skipped over. So just to look very briefly at what is isinglass and what is the process of fining of beer and wine. To mention that it's got a long history, I think several hundred years at least, maybe more. I noticed somebody had mentioned how difficult it was to find information about the Moor trade. I certainly found that when it came to the to isinglass. I did manage to dig out a bit of information about species that are used and did a quick evaluation of what's known about those species, and then wanted to have a think about down the track, how do we try and engage the industry in some sort of productive activity towards sustainable use. The process of brewing and fermentation creates a lot of fine particles. So it may be that they're already in the liquid which is being fermented. So you know, the process of making wine from grapes, there'd be a lot of cloudiness in the wine, but then also, you know, the growth of the yeast itself creates particles in the wine or beer, and this creates a whole stack of sort of cloudiness in the liquid, which needs to be removed. So they need something, the winemakers or the brewers need some product which attracts all these particles together and allows them to settle to the bottom of the container, and the process is called fining. So we know that isinglass, which is made from fish maw, has been used for hundreds of years, but it's also a product which has been used for other purposes in the past, such as preserving eggs, and it's interesting to see what other products fish maws have been used for in the past as well. For many years, the swim bladder of choice was from species of sturgeon, but for a whole variety of reasons. Obviously, cost has been a big one, but I mean, sturgeons are in a lot of trouble from a conservation perspective, and so declining availability has affected the availability of fish maw, and so the trade has shifted to other species of fish. Once the maw has been removed from the fish, it's dried and then turned into a powder, and this powder can be exported around the world. And to make isinglass, the powder is mixed with water and it's then added to the wine or beer. And as I said earlier, it causes the particles to be attracted to I think it's the collagen in the fish maw, and then settles to the bottom. There are lots of other substances which are used as fining agencies, and bentonite, I think that's a type of clay, egg white, casein, gelatin, skim milk, and carbon. But they also are used for different types of beers or wines, and they may be more suited to one drink or another. And so there's a bunch of characteristics which winemakers look for, such as, you know, whether the particular product removes tannin out of the wine, whether it has any impact on removing colour over fining. I'm not entirely sure what that is. And then also whether it achieves their desired aims of clarity and stability. And so this has an influence over whether isinglass can be substituted by other materials. There is some move to produce isinglass in some beer products and wine products. It's possible to find, you know, vegan wines and vegan beers. Whether it's possible to completely remove it for all types of products is another question. And I also found that the same product may require different types of fining agents to achieve the goals of the winemaker. Trying to find out how much FishMatter is used in isinglass is really difficult. And so some of the trade data Simone helped me with, and we just looked at imports to Europe. And but obviously Europe is just sort of one part of the world which makes beer and wine. It's almost impossible to find out via internet searches from the companies that are involved what the volumes are. And certainly in terms of the trade data, it's really difficult to work out or to separate FishMatter from other types of products, which I'll show you in the next slide. But potentially the trade is significant. But again, it really depends upon which of those volumes is actually FishMatter versus other types of fining products. So as you can see here, the trade code covers a whole bunch of things, some of which may be isinglass, some of which may be related products. So as I said earlier, FishMatter has been used in the past for making glues, and also particularly for use in fine art, for example. And so there's certainly a need to try and separate out some of these other products from the trade in isinglass. And noting that I think in the previous slide, dried FishMatter represents 100 tons of FishMatter is comes from about 10,000 tons of whole fish. So the big players there, Belgium in particular, Austria amongst are the two biggest importers in Europe. But depending upon which particular trade code you use. So I then had a look through the literature where I could, and also managed to get some contacts in the trade. And it took quite a while and quite a number of emails to get people to engage in the subject, and didn't really wasn't greeted with a lot of enthusiasm, to be honest. So these are the species that I've managed to find out about. There's some good literature from India, for example. One of the magazines which is more directed towards the general public. As you can see there's a couple of cyanids which are being used for FishMatter, where there's a specific reference to the manufacture of isinglass, and then also the one of the pike eels as well. A lot of the other ones are catfish, and again you can see some marine catfish, India, Pakistan. These were mentioned by the industry and as being used and imported into Europe in particular. Interestingly, and in the context of one of the discussions, I think on Thursday, one of the cyanids, a corvina from South America, is also being sourced to make isinglass for use in Europe. There was also a little bit of uncertainty about species, and so there's apparently a list of approved species that one of the industry bodies has, but I couldn't really work out exactly what that particular species was when I had a good look through. So certainly compared to the discussions we've had so far, the catfish seem to be particularly important, and particularly from India and Pakistan going into Europe. So I then had a quick look at the IUCN red list. I didn't have time to go into detail on what was known about stock status for some of these species. I think in the context of Claire's talk, some of the cyanids come up as being a particular risk, and certainly the one from South America, the Corvina, is one which is of particular concern. The other ones, it's I mean, there's just insufficient information, particularly for the catfish. But certainly, what we know about marine catfishes from other parts of the world, they do seem to be very vulnerable to fishing pressure, and there's certainly plenty of papers from India in particular about concerns over the status of catfishes, and it might be something which one of our speakers tomorrow will be able to help us with. So, I mean, this is an area which requires a lot more time than I had to dig into in a lot of detail. But you know, we know that fish maws have been used for centuries, and they continue to be used. As I said earlier, yes, there is some shift to using alternative products in some wines and beers, but as to how widespread that is basically unknown, and whether there's a potential to substitute isinglass for other products for all wines and beers is an open question that one would need to discuss with the industry. Finding out exactly the volumes used is difficult to ascertain, but given the volume of wine and beer produced, it's certainly unlikely to be trivial. Where the species come from and their sources in terms of fisheries, whether they're gillnet fisheries or trawl fisheries or inshore, offshore, small scale, large scale, it's really unknown. And so it's certainly an area which I think requires some further information. I mentioned earlier about the substitution. Yes, there's a lot of media coverage about vegan beers and wines, but that doesn't mean to say that they represent a large proportion of their production. Certainly the beverage industry doesn't seem to be all that engaged on the topic. I was not really all that encouraged in terms of my inquiries. I did find that there was a code of practice for the beverage industry in the UK, but that code of practice wasn't publicly available. So I think there's a need to raise this issue with the industry directly. I think there's certainly a need to gather some more information. It may be that there's not really an issue, but you know, based upon the bits that I've gathered so far, I think there's certainly a need to collect some more information. I've only looked at the UK and Europe, but certainly the US, well, basically lots of countries have beer industries and many others have wine industries as well. I think there's a need to engage the industry and have a conversation with them about whether their supplies are from sustainable sources. It's certainly that sort of conversation been had with elements of the fishing industry for many years about food fish and fish meal, etc. And it's probably worthwhile having a discussion with the food and beverage industry as well. So it was an interesting area to investigate, and I thought that I would put this forward as something which people need to maybe have a think about as we develop this project area further. So happy to take any questions, and yeah. So if there's no particular questions about the wine and beer side of things, we do have time for an open discussion. And so we've had the presentation earlier from Brian and Elisabeth, and then from Claire, and then from Simone. I've been writing down a list of observations. You know, there's prices, identification, farming, secrecy. Pretty much happy to take questions, and as Liberty said, please raise your hand if you have if you want to raise your question verbally rather than in the chat area, please. Okay, thanks, Jeff. We'll see you tomorrow. I know it's getting late. So yeah, we'll keep the floor open for a few more minutes. But if people want to sign out, I'm quite happy to close off, and then we'll reconvene tomorrow. Okay, well, we might give everyone an early mark. Tomorrow we'll be starting again at 9 a.m. Central European time. Tomorrow we have presentations from Yvonne, who's going to do an overview of what's currently known about the Fishmore trade. Stan from Bloom, based in Hong Kong, is going to do an updated analysis of imports and sources and volumes of trade into Hong Kong. Dr. Akhilesh from CFMRI in India is going to look at the supply chain and mapping of the swim bladder trade in India. Bailin, who we've already heard from briefly, going to give a presentation, a bit more detail about identification. And then Michael Grant from James Cook University in Australia is going to do a presentation about what's happening in Papua New Guinea. Okay, Matthew, do you want to follow that up tomorrow, or that might be are people happy to, so is somebody happy to answer that question now? Okay, rightio. Well, thanks everybody for joining in, and we'll look forward to starting again tomorrow evening or tomorrow morning. Thank you.